días, buenos días. Bienvenidos para nuestro último día, viernes 23 de octubre, último día de este simposio. Un día que va a ser muy interesante porque en este día tendremos la oportunidad de visitar virtualmente, gracias COVID, pero de tener una visita muy interesante a una de las plantas más modernas del país y probablemente del continente latinoamericano. Antes de esto, tenemos que dar la bienvenida a Zulay Sandi. Zulay nos va a presentar el tema de cómo la era digital y el análisis de datos transforman las operaciones farmacéuticas. Zulay, desde Nueva York, nos vamos a enlazar con Nueva York. Zulay Sandi, de Quantum Black, que es una compañía del grupo McKinsey. Zulay está basado en Nueva York, ya se lo dije, y es especialista en digitalización. Es experto en mejores resultados de sus clientes del sector biofarma usando tecnología 4.0. Tenemos toda su reseña, ha trabajado con muchísimas compañías en el tema específico de digitalización, de Pharma 4.0, de adquisición, análisis de datos, etcétera, etcétera. Escuchamos a Zulay. Zulay, go ahead, please.
Good morning, all. I'm Sulay Sandy, an associate partner with Quantum Black based in New York. Quantum Black is wholly owned by McKinsey, and we're the digital and analytics center of excellence within McKinsey. And at Quantum Black, I do all of my work in the pharma and biopharma space. And my work centers around everything to do with digital and analytics transformations. And I'm here today to actually talk to you about my experiences in that space. So thank you again for having me. In terms of what I want to talk about today, there's really two things. One is to share perspectives on the future of digital and advanced analytics in the biopharma space. And then number two, to bring that to life with some examples that I have personally worked on, where we've helped some pharma companies really transform how they do business and drive impact. If you kind of think of, the future of digital and analytics in the pharma space, I think a parallel I always like to talk about is, going back to the start of the early 20th century, where, you had horses, and everybody kind of thought the people that were actually making cars were not going to survive, right? And if you, an illustration of that is if you move to, the next slide. This is actually an ad from, I think 1911, correct? That, it was horses versus automobiles. And essentially the message here was, still stick to your horse because the automobile is not going to go anywhere. It wasn't, a lot of people at that time actually thought that technology itself wasn't going to survive. So if you bring that back to today and you think of the work you do, a lot of the things we're going to talk about today are actually things that are happening, and you have to be able to imagine the future in terms of how to drive digital and analytics within your organization. And so I think the key question for you is, can you actually see the future of pharma operations, right? Think about that. How, 5-10 years from now, what do you see in your company? How do you see yourself changing how you drive your operations and do your work? Over the next couple of slides, I'll just give you a little bit of a peek on what we believe is the future. And all of these are actually, in certain cases actually exist today in terms of companies that are driving that type of transformation and change. I think the first thing to talk about is documentation. Paper documentation would actually, over the course of time, will actually disappear within your operations. And we've already seen that today, where I have a client today that's actually, their batch records are all electronic. Their CFAs, they're working with their vendor now, where all of their CFAs are actually going to be digitized, right? So just think of, over the course of time, a lot of the things that you record on paper is going to disappear. And what that's going to allow you to do is actually have this massive trove of data that you can then use to drive performance within your organization. In the risk space, we think quality risks will be, predicted and avoided. As it is right now, it's very reactive. I go through a process, I produce a product, I end up having some deviations, I figure out, what are my cappers, and I close it out. But think of a case where, using advanced analytics and predictive algorithms, you can actually be able to predict what the quality of your product is going to be before you actually produce it. So things like parametric release today, there's actually companies that are trialing that, where before you produce the product, you look at the raw materials, you look at what's, you look at the people, you look at the machines that are running the product, you look at all your processes, you can actually model that. And before you even start the production, actually predict what that quality is going to be. And that would then allow you to actually take mitigating actions before you actually get to the end and find out that you actually have a problem. And we believe that planning and scheduling will be autonomous. I think the farmer space, in farmer, there's still a long way to go to get to this, but we've actually seen this in other industries where, your end-to-end planning is now actually driven by an algorithm, and there's minimal human intervention. And imagine the benefits you'll get from this. If you even think of, stepping back to when COVID happened, and lots of companies were trying to, understand their supply chains, understand where their products are, that really requires you to have some agility and nimbleness in your supply chain. And you can't have that without some level of autonomous planning. And we think with that, it will help you transform how you drive your operations in terms of how you get products to customers, but also actually how you react to changes, whether it's internal or actually external from a market perspective. And I think another area of immense potential, again, where we've seen quite a bit of work, is looking at your product release. Today, it takes months and sometimes years, 18 months to go from your product development to actually being able to manufacture and release that product. We've seen cases now of actually clients using the concept of a digital twin, and think of a digital twin as just a digital replica of your end-to-end process. So if you can think of, going from product development all the way to manufacturing, if you can actually have that two-way flow of data, and can digitize that information using the concept of digital twins, you can fundamentally accelerate how you actually get your products to market. Because even before, instead of doing, 20, 30, 40, 50 tests, you can essentially use models to actually, or algorithms to actually run those types of tests. So it takes a lot of slack and a lot of time out of your operations. And what that allows you to do is to essentially, in a real-time way, right, model and then move your products from, your product development to your manufacturing in real time. But again, the core that you need for that is that data foundation that links both of those together. And we also believe, and this is something we've seen, that predictive models and optimization will eliminate equipment failures. So you'd essentially, and the opportunities here is to be able to double your OEE. So whether it's on a packaging line, where we've actually done quite a bit of work, really around using predictive algorithms, optimization, being able to understand what are the right types of parameters every time you're running a batch. So what batch you're running, what are the raw materials, who's working on the line, what are the different types of SKUs that you're going to produce, and being able to actually optimize that to actually get rid of downtimes or micro stops. And one of the cases I'll actually talk about later in the presentation will bring this to life. And launches and transfers, we also believe, will be modeled in silico. And really what this means is, again, as you go from, as you go from launching products or actually transferring products between your different plants, I think if you have that data backbone that links and ties all of these together, you can actually model or simulate that product transfer even before you physically do it. And that would, again, enable you to cut and eliminate a lot of time in that actual product transfer process. And we also believe, and I think a lot of people here will be familiar with this, that you're actually going to have a control tower, right, that would actually run your smart factories. So having all your factories connected, and then having this location, it could even be remote, correct, from where you can actually manage and run your factories. And again, this requires the data backbone, it requires connectivity, but we actually see clients that are mostly outside of pharma space, but we think there's pharma companies that are also going in this direction now. But we actually do see companies that are actually doing this today. that essentially have some automated factories. There's some human interventions here and there, but there's essentially a remote center that can run that factory remotely. And what does all of this mean? I think it means 90% of the jobs that you have today will change, right? It's a new paradigm of working. It's a new set of skills. You essentially have to retrain your whole workforce in terms of being able to work with this new paradigm and with these new tools. And I think this is something that a lot of clients underestimate in terms of how you actually have to massively upskill and retrain your workforce. I think with also automation, we believe 50% of tasks will be, 50% of tasks will be automated. So a lot of if you think of supply chain, if you have an autonomous supply chain, then your planners can actually be doing a lot more things that are value added, as opposed to, moving around spreadsheets, calculating numbers, putting it into SAP, getting it out of SAP, or if you even think in a quality space, a lot of the work that your QC analysts do in terms of deviations, management, if you can actually have a predictive algorithm that will suggest the causes of your deviation, it brings, again, some level of automation to that and reducing the amount of time you actually spend doing that task. And overall, we think 40% of the tasks that you do today will actually be eliminated from the sites. Again, so similar to, examples about the deviations, supply chain, or if you have an automated process for, running a particular line, a lot of those tasks would actually be eliminated as you go into the future. With all of these things, I think they all sound very futuristic, but actually we've seen that today. And what you see on this slide here is the World Economic Forum has actually recognized a number of Industry 4.0 lighthouses across the globe. And these are essentially sites that have fundamentally transformed the way they do business using digital and analytics. So some of the components I just talked about are actually present at some of the sites. But not only have they transformed the way they do it, they've also built out solutions that are actually scalable. So actually, if you can do it at one plant, you can take that same solution and move it to another plant and be able to scale that quite easily. I have personally, for some of the pharma companies here, I've personally worked on 3 of the pharma companies that are actually on this page here, where we've helped them transform the way they manufacture products and deliver significant impact through that process. So really, as you think about this, it's not just futuristic, it's actually here today. And it's something that you can act on today and actually start transforming the way you run your business. And I think with a lot of these transformations, so I talked about, how it would impact how you run your business. So, tasks been eliminated, tasks been automated. But from an impact perspective, what's the bottom line impact of this? Because you're not doing digital and analytics just for the sake of doing digital. What actually is this going to do from a business value perspective? And these are examples that we've actually seen where you can reduce your deviations, quality deviations, by 80%. So think of the amount of, think of the cost associated with, good quality, poor quality. How do you actually take that out of your system using digital and analytics? We think you will get to 2 times the productivity that you have today, again, using some of these tools. This would also result in, we've seen cases of about a 60% reduction in lead times. So actually, again, using the supply chain examples, using some of the digital twin concepts from product development to manufacturing or launch, pulling all of those together would actually substantially drive down your lead times. And ultimately, we've also seen cases of massive reductions in the assets and inventory spend, so your CapEx. Because obviously, if you can use your existing install base to produce more, then you don't actually have to invest in more, factories and machines. one of the farmer lighthouse cases I actually worked on was exactly this case, where we were able to save them about $150 million in terms of additional investments that were required for installing new machines. We got the capacity up by about 22%, and as a result of that, they did not have to make those investments in machines. And we think with all of these, with all of these benefits, you really have an opportunity to, across your value chain, drive transformations. And what you see here is, think of your end-to-end, right? So from your four walls of your factory to your overall supply chain, there's a set of digital analytics use cases that have been proven, as you can see here, that most likely you're not going to be doing for the first time. Somebody's already done this. Somebody's already learned from doing these. And so these are very mature solutions that you can use end to end across your process to be able to drive value within your supply chain. And now what I want to do is, I think having talked about what the future would look like, what's the value that you can actually derive from digital and analytics? What I want to talk about is actually two cases that will help bring this to life. Just to give you a feel for what your competitors or what other farming companies are actually doing in this space. The first case is for a major farmer that produces an oral solid dose, where we're able to take the whole site and fundamentally transform that site and drive significant impact. I'll talk about that. And then the second one, we've tried to also look at, I've tried to include something on the biologics front, where within a biologics manufacturing, we've been able to substantially reduce the occurrence of deviations within their manufacturing process, using a set of artificial intelligence and analytics solutions. So let's deep dive into the first use case. This is a site that was actually, so it's one of the first World Economic Forum nominated lighthouses. And again, the concept of a lighthouse is an organization that has fundamentally transformed the way they work. They've delivered significant impact in terms of value, and they've also actually built a scalable solution. So this plant was actually based in Europe, and we did this work there about 2 years ago. Just to give you a sense for these companies that are well on the way in terms of really driving digital and analytics. So as you think about that, I think this is the time to now actually start that, because a lot of competitors are much more advanced than you. At this particular site, what we did was, we went into the site, and the challenge here was they were expecting a massive amount of demand growth. So I think it was about a 30% volume increase that they were expecting. So they essentially had to produce 30% more. And that 30% more just wasn't on the same product. It was actually a combination of products. So there was actually going to be a more, product mix was actually going to get more complex, which just meant, there was going to be lots of changeovers. There was going to be, you required a certain level of agility and nimbleness, because, orders might change depending on what market you're shipping to. And with all of that, they were also looking to bring on additional people to the organization or into this particular factory. And then the expectation there was, there's going to be about a 50% additional people brought into the workforce, right? How do you bring people with minimal experience into the workforce, but actually get them to perform at a very high level? So what we did in this particular case was obviously started with an end-to-end diagnosis of the plant. And coming out of that diagnosis, what we identified were all the bottlenecks or all the spots where we think we could deploy digital and analytic solutions to either debottleneck or actually improve output. And I think that's key. So as you think about leveraging digital and analytics, think of it as trying to solve the problem as opposed to just trying to build out a fancy technology solution. In this particular case, as you can see on the right-hand side, we deployed about 8 different use cases across the value chain. So going from digital performance management, using augmented reality to optimize how they do their changeovers and actually run some of their processes. And this is really critical for the new people that they were bringing in, because then you had a set of instructions, you had a set of you had a set of instruments that will actually aid these people in terms of how they run their processes, so they didn't have to learn on the fly. We also used advanced analytics and some optimization techniques to reduce breakdowns on their lines. On their in their QC lab, which is also a bottleneck. So we found that a lot of times, after the product came out of manufacturing, there was a massive bottleneck to get through the QC lab. So using their existing instruments and people, we actually built a digital twin schedule optimizer that can actually improve productivity. So with their current install base, we're actually able to improve productivity by about 50%. So that's just to give you a flavor of the types of use cases that we built. And to do that, we also pulled data from all of the systems at the plant and actually some of their global systems. So from systems like SAP, LIMS, some additional ERP systems. They had a data warehouse. We also pulled data from their PLC systems. There were actually some data sources that were Excel based. So think of your overall IT OT stack. We pulled data from all of those, linked those data sets, and then use that as a way to drive these use cases. And underlying all of that was obviously driving your change management and capability building, right? So technology, you can deploy all of these solutions, but if people don't know how to use them or people don't use them, you're not going to get the value. So actually a big challenge as you do digital analytics is around how you upskill your people, how you drive change so people can actually learn these new ways of working and actually take them on as they go forward. And then finally, it's all around also building a scalable solution, right? You don't want to build something that not very scalable, that requires lots of maintenance. So as you do this, as you deliver this value, how do you also build out a scalable solution? This first iteration of the solution was actually built in 9 months. So it's not what I've described as essentially a 9-month process. So it wasn't, 3-4 years. And there's ways you can actually do that to be able to drive value in year. In terms of impact, I think I talked about this a little bit on the previous slide, but on their QC labs, we're able to drive up productivity by 50%. So, using a digital twin scheduler that could essentially optimize, how you allocate your machines and your people and your tests. We took a lot of slack out of the system, so no, the supervisor no longer had the spreadsheet that had these 5 people are doing these tests, or somebody calls out and you're not sure what to do. In this particular solution, it was a very agile solution. Somebody calls out and you can actually go into the tool and say this person is not working today, and then have the tool actually re-optimize and set up how you do your tests. A good example was also tests that take about 6 hours to run, and people would come in the morning and set up that test and then leave it to run. Well, actually you could optimize that so you set that test up to run when you're going home at night, correct? And you come back that morning, it's done. But it's essentially being able to do this in a very systemic way, using sophisticated algorithms to be able to drive performance. We were able to reduce changeovers by about 30%. And we reduced OEE by about 40 to 50, improved OEE by about 40 to 50%. We'll talk a little bit about that. Deviations reductions that I talked about earlier, we were actually able to reduce the deviations by about 80%. And this was using, again, machine learning techniques to do two things. One is to actually understand what's the root cause of the deviation. Because, step back and think of, your deviations management process. You have a deviation, you put in place a capper, but the same deviation reoccurs, correct? So most likely whatever you're doing is actually not getting to the root cause of the deviations. But you can actually use machine learning techniques to be able to connect deviations to actual root causes. And then that would actually allow you to substantially reduce the number of deviations. And then finally, we were also able to reduce deviations handling time by about 90%. So this is more around, and when a deviation occurs, how much time do I actually spend triaging that deviation? In this particular case, it took him about 8 hours from the time a deviation occurred to actually coming up with the corrective action. What we did in this case was actually built a predictive algorithm that when a deviation occurs, we look at the footprint of that deviation, when the process did the deviation occur, what product were you producing, what machine was it running on, who was actually running that machine, pulling all of that together, and we actually give the analyst a suggestion that says the most likely root cause could be one of two or three things with a certain level of probability. So that essentially allowed them to cut out a lot of the initial investigation. And this allowed them to go from about 8 hours to about 30 minutes to actually closing a deviation. And so this is just an example of the work we did on a packaging line where we improved the OEE by about 40 to 50%. The challenge here was actually micro stops. So micro stops were the biggest drive, were the biggest destroyers of value from an OEE perspective. What we did in this particular case was, took lots of data about the packaging line production process. So data from their SCADA systems, from their manufacturing execution systems, from their OEE tracking systems. We also took data from PLCs that would actually, give you event information, but also actually just the machine log data. We pulled all of that together and linked that together to be able to then build these up, to be able to then build a machine learning algorithm that would actually point us to what were the drivers of the micro stops. This is very significant. So if you think of data science, if you think of artificial intelligence and machine learning, the data science and machine learning, it's a really interesting bit that everybody gets excited about. But actually, 80% of that work is actually in getting your data right. So as you think about this, right? Think about, you need people that can actually do this type of work, not only build the models, but actually take these data sets, link them together, make sure they're clean, and then taking that and then putting that into models that you can run. In terms of so this is just a really good example of some of the things that were actually impacting the micro stops. So what you see here, and I'll just take if you take on the right hand side the split roller A and B speed, that top box, what you see there is those are actually the blue lines are actually not lines, they're all dots. And what that graph is just telling you is it just tells you for that particular machine setting. So these are all settings on the machine. It just tells you what the various operators were using. So what this tells you is really every operator, used a different set of setting every time they were starting a batch for this particular machine. Ideally, what you want is every operator to have an optimal setting depending on the product you're producing, the machine you're running it in, what you're running it on, what are the types of raw materials that you're using as part of that, what are the packaging materials that you're using, getting what the optimal settings were. but that wasn't the case. And this was actually, the models indicated that actually these were some of the key drivers of the micro stops. So to solve this particular problem, what we had to do was then to take all of these, 36 plus parameters and say, what's the optimal setting for these? So it's more of a operations research problem. It's more of a operations research problem that will say, actually, what are, across my products that I'm producing, across those SKUs, across my machines, across the raw materials that I'm using, what actually are the optimal settings for each one of those, and being able to have an algorithm that will actually tell you what those settings are. On this slide here, what you see is just an example of some of those findings. So on the left-hand side, these were the top drivers of the breakdowns. So you can see, the tablet stop in a drop channel was actually a big driver of micro stops. The gluing box, as you can see, which is number 4 on the list, was also actually a big driver of micro stops. And that's the beauty of using, again, machine learning techniques and advanced analytics. You can actually find what are the things that are driving the micro stops, but also be able to actually quantify that. So if you take that gluing box example, after we'd actually set up the optimization and actually given that to the operators, they started using that, and the micro stops actually went significantly down. So if you look at the right-hand side, that just gives you a view, a real-time view of what was actually happening at the plant. So the x-axis in this case is the weeks. So we, just from week 1 to week 14, and then the y-axis was just the number of hours per week that were attributed to the glue-gun breakdowns. So you can see for the first 4 weeks, it was an average of, about 3, hours a week actually lost on just that particular type of micro stop or breakdown. Between week 4 and week 5 was when we actually implemented the optimization parameters, and you can actually see that particular type of breakdown went down. And by week 7, we had totally eliminated that. So just think of, at this point in time, there was 3 hours that, about 3 hours a week that you were losing to, just one type of micro stop that you could then now actually use to produce more products. And then what you see in week 9 and 10 was that particular breakdown started happening again. I remember at the site, it was, I think everybody was saying, well, is the model actually correct? Because, why is this breakdown starting to happen? Actually, when we dug a little deeper and interviewed people, what happened was there was a particular operator working at night that actually decided not to use the optimized settings and actually went back to doing things the old way. And that was the reason for this. And again, the learning there is, as I mentioned earlier, is, you can build these solutions all you want. If people are not using it, you're not going to be able to drive a change. And, as expected, with some amount of training and actually say to them, this is something that you have to use because it's driving performance and helping us get better. You can see after week 11, that was also eliminated. Another solution we built at the client was, and I talked about this, was in the QC labs, where again, that was a bottleneck. So between, actually releasing the product, that velocity was very slow, just because there was a bottleneck between production and the QC lab. And again, in this particular case, what we did was, looked at what are the lab equipment, what's your supply schedule, what are the tests that you have to do, what are all the standard times, what are the people, and what's your production plan, pulling all of that together. And building a schedule optimizer. And what you see on the right-hand side was actually, what the schedule operator, what the QC supervisor would look at on a daily basis or on an hourly basis, and at any point in time, be able to optimize their schedule. And as a result of that, actually, as I mentioned earlier, we're able to improve the capacity in the QC lab by about 50%. So without adding new people, without adding new machines, they could actually do 50% more tests, all due to, again, the impact and the power of some analytics and machine learning solutions. And then before I jump into the next case, which is on biologics, and we'll talk a little bit about, deviations reduction specific in that case. But what I wanted to give you a sense for was there's actually a host of use cases that you can deploy within biologics. And again, these are all things that we've worked on and deployed and other people have done. So these are not new across your end-to-end value stream. So going from your upstream to your downstream. And it includes things like yield improvement, which is really key in biologics, especially within a drug substance, right? If you can improve your yield by, between 5 to 10%, which we've seen as the average, it's a significant amount of value that you can actually realize. There's also interventions or digital solutions around, cycle time reduction. There's also solutions around actually raw material variability. How do you manage that to ensure that you actually produce, better quality products? And then there's also solutions around quality control and assurance. But what I want to do is just deep dive a little bit on the deviations reduction within the biologic space. So this was again a monoclonal antibody drug substance manufacturer in Europe. We had within McKinsey we have a benchmarking service called POBOS, where we look at manufacturers across the globe. I think we look at over 700 or 800 manufacturers, and we do these benchmarking surveys that look at various aspects of their performance. One of those aspects is actually around quality management. This particular site was actually top quartile in terms of how they manage and handle their deviations. So what that meant, it's actually a very good performing site. They employed a lot of lean tools and lean techniques to be able to really optimize and reduce deviations. And so the challenge for us, and this is a case I personally worked on, the previous one I also worked on. The challenge for us was, we had a site that was already very good performing. Could we actually use, again, analytics and AI techniques to actually even provide an additional step change in terms of how they manage their deviations? In this particular case, we looked at two of their major production processes. So it was primarily the fermentation process and then the primary recovery process. We pulled together data from 17 different sources. And again, alluding to what I talked about earlier, a lot of work is actually getting all of this data and linking that together, because most of these data sources are very siloed. So if you think of it, you have time series, you'd have time series data in your PI system, and then you have your, kind of batch level information. How do you link that together? You don't actually have any specific keys to link that together on. So there's various techniques that you can use to find a way to link those data sets to be able to then take that to build out the models. And the data sets that we pulled together covered things like, people and shift data. We actually, and that's also a key thing, right? As you think of doing these things, actually look at human performance is also actually a big driver of variability in the process. So that's something you should be able to pull into your models and be able to measure, where you're not doing it at the person level, but you're doing it more at the skills groups level, correct? So you're looking and saying, what's the experience of a team? How long have they worked together, right? What are the types of trainings that they've taken? Because those are things that can actually impact how you do, how you drive performance. We looked at obviously the deviations data. We looked at raw material data. We looked at the mediums and buffers that they pulled into the process. We looked at the equipment information, understanding, when was an equipment serviced, what are the various components of an equipment, what are the sub-equipment, what are the things that you switch between equipments, what are the cleaning procedures. So lots and lots of data. And during this process, we actually created over 1,000 variables or features that we pulled into the model. And these variables or features are, things that we actually call them handcrafted, correct? They're not necessarily available in the raw data. So for instance, I'd have a variable that said, when was the last time person A worked on a batch? Well, you don't have that information captured anywhere. You need to pull the schedule information, you need to pull the batch information, and you need to pull your shift schedule together to actually be able to derive that. So we create over 1,000 of those types of variables. And in the end, what we're able to do using, again, analytic solutions, in this case, an explanatory and then a predictive machine learning model, we could clearly explain what was the driver for 6 to 7% of the deviations. So think of that, lots of, really good performing sites, but still, a good amount of deviations. We could clearly say, actually, for 6 to 7% of these deviations, this is clearly what's driving that. And the gap in that explanation is obviously there were data quality issues. There were certain areas where we didn't have data. So, you're not going to get to 100% in terms of being able to explain what's driving the deviation, but 6 to 7% was good enough. And then as a result of that, we put in place actions that were actually that enabled them to actually reduce the deviations by about 36%. And the reason there's a gap between the 6 to 7 and 36 is there's obviously, things that are driving deviations. For instance, there was a certain type of machine, there was a certain, bioreactor, we could clearly say this particular bioreactor, when configured this particular way, was actually driving deviations. Well, you're not going to go change your bioreactor tomorrow. And so that was something they couldn't, do, right away. But there were actually, the 36% were near-term, medium-term interventions that they could actually put in place to actually drive performance. And these did not require any type of regulatory violence or regulatory changes, correct? Because it was all things that were within the current current operating standards. And in terms of what we did, I wouldn't go through all of the details here, but what you can see in this slide is, as we started this work, the site had certain beliefs, and then using digital analytics, we're actually able to disprove some of these beliefs or actually confirm some of them. So one of them was, they said to us as we went through the process, the way we load our columns doesn't vary. And we definitely know that doesn't affect deviations. Actually, as part of this process, we found that actually there was a 50% variability, and that actually impacted the deviations. And same for the age of the media pulled into the process. They said as long as the media hadn't expired, it didn't actually have an impact on the deviations. Right? But actually, when we looked at this and actually modeled this, we could clearly see that older media, actually it was media after 3 days old, actually had an impact on the deviations. And that had to do with the rate at which the pH decreased in the media. And so one of the things we also did was, to be able to get to the quantification of the value, was to actually build again, you've heard me use the concept of a digital twin, which you can use, to model a process. In this particular case, to be able to actually understand with all of these, we found what the root causes were. If we fix those root causes, what's actually the uplift, correct? How is that going to impact our process? Well, we could actually simulate that using a digital twin concept. So if I can actually take the whole process represented in a digital way using the data they have, I can then say, if I pull, if I pull these 3 levers up and pull this lever down, what's my output? And we're able to do that, and that's what you see here. So we could clearly go from what was observed and and then building a scenario to say, actually, with this particular scenario, what's the uplift that we expect? And that's how we were able to get to that 35% number. And then they put those actions into place, and did actually get roughly around 36% in terms of the reduction in deviations. So I think with all of this said, as we wrap up, one question people always ask is, well, where do you start? And I think there's kind of three ways you can do this. One is, depending on what your aspiration is, you can do an end-to-end transformation across your value chain, right? So you can take your supply chain and actually say, I want to use digital and analytics to transform my end-to-end supply chain. I want to increase, I want to improve my lead times. I want to include my OTIF. I want to build nimbleness and agility into my supply chain, right? Whatever your aspirations are. Or you could actually say, I'm going to take a plant within the four walls of a plant, similar to the first use case I talked about, and say, actually, I've got a burning platform at this plant, and I actually want to transform across, end to end within that plant. And then thirdly, that could be a targeted use case, like the second one we talked about, on deviations reduction, right? Where you think that's really just a key a key value driver, or something like yield improvement out of biologics, where you say that's a massive value driver. If I can improve my yield by 10%, I'll drive a lot of impact, right? But there's all of these archetypes that you can use to actually start the work that you do. The two things you have to keep in mind is to obviously, as you do this, bring the site along with you, or bring your people along with you, and build something that's scalable and reusable, not doing it as just a one-off, right? So that way you can continue to build out that transformation across your value chain or your network, or whatever your aspirations are. To conclude, there are a set of guiding principles that really drive digital transformation. So one is having a robust business case. It's not about technology, it's about the impact and the value that you want to drive. Number two is select the use cases that are really going to drive performance across the board. And our preference is always, if I go into a plant, don't do one use case. Look end to end within the plant and see how you can drive performance. And if you use that approach, you're going to end up implementing what we call the lighthouse approach, where there's 4 or 5 or 6 different use cases that you actually have to cobble together to drive that performance. The good news is, for all of those use cases, they all use roughly the same set of data. And so if you can get that data curated and set up, then you can actually build additional use cases on top of it. Start with 1 or 2 pilot plants, right, where you can actually roll this out and deliver the full system, as opposed to trying to tackle all of your plants at the same time. But at the same time, as you start, try and build the capabilities of your plant, in terms of technical capability, but actually the people that also run the plant, so they can actually get to use these solutions and embed these solutions in the way they work. And another key point here is to be very pragmatic. So start with don't try and eat the whole elephant in 1 week. Do it in, start with the MVP approach, right? Go with an agile approach where you start delivering value in chunks. So, people don't have an appetite for a 3-year program. At the end of the 3 years, you see, I'm going to deliver value. Actually break it out into chunks. Every 3 months or every 6 months, you're delivering something that's actually delivering value, and then you can continue to build up on that. And ultimately, as you drive these transformations, especially within your plants, you have to get your IT, OT infrastructure and capabilities set up right to be able to scale these solutions. And then I think finally, and one of the most important points is your leaders have to be engaged. These solutions or these initiatives go nowhere if the senior leaders are not bought in and actually engaged in the process. And then in terms of people, I think I talked about capability development, but this just gives you a view of, what are the types of skills that you need to actually be able to drive these types of solutions. So you need technical people like data scientists, you need your analysts, you need translators. Translators are the people that can help bridge that gap between the technical folks and the business folks. So in terms of, what does, I come up with an insight, is that insight actually valuable? Does that insight actually make sense? And how do I take that and apply that to my process? You need your business owners engaged, and then ultimately you also need your IT and your data specialist all working together as a team to drive the performance. And finally, I think I talked about leadership. I think for your leaders, what I say this all the time, and we say too that leaders have to change. Right? If you want to drive real impact using digital and analytics, your leadership model has to change. Your leaders have to think strategically about how they drive, about how you drive digital and analytics. It's going from delegating to people and being in the passenger seat to actually having the skills and being able to actually drive this. And that means you actually have to fundamentally understand what digital and analytics is. So I always say to senior leaders I speak to, if you can't tell me what a machine learning, what is machine learning, what does it do, correct? How does that impact? What's the value of it? It's not a technical concept. You should be able to explain it in a business concept. If as a leader, if you can't explain that, then you probably not going to understand the impact of everything I've talked about here today. So there's a massive amount of education as a leader that you have to do to get yourself equipped to really start these programs, but also drive these programs within your organization. With that, I'll stop there. But again, thank you very much for your time. And my contact details are on the screen. If you need a follow-up or want to have a chat about any of these, what we talked about here, happy to connect with you. But again, thank you very much.
Sulay, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. How are you?
I am very, very good.
Okay,
very good.
Thank you. Thanks also for being available and online live. Sulay, allow me to make some questions. The assistants sent us several questions.
Perfect.
I will give the question first in Spanish and then translate in English for you, okay?
Okay.
First question, primera pregunta, ¿cuáles son las áreas en donde es más fácil que se implemente la tecnología blockchain en la industria farmacéutica? Which should be something like, in which areas is it easier to implement blockchain technology in the pharma industry?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's several areas where I've seen it drive value, and so I will reframe the question as maybe not necessarily where it's easy, but where you get the most value from implementing blockchain. I think two areas where I've seen that is one, I think in the whole kind of supply chain area, the whole bit around kind of serialization, but also actually being able to just maintain integrity of, end-to-end supply chain. I've seen some cases there. There's actually a startup in London sponsored by Oxford University that's actually doing quite a bit of work there. And then I think the other area is around, I think, information integrity, correct? So the whole bit around data integrity, being able to understand when changes are made, who makes changes, especially in this day and age where actually, a few pharma companies now have been fined, correct, by the FDA that we know of, for not having the absolute, level of data integrity. So those are two areas where I've seen the value, but I'll say start with what's the problem you're trying to solve and see if blockchain is an answer.
Yeah, it's probably not the solution for all kind of situations, obviously.
Yeah.
Next question. ¿Nos podrías compartir un caso de éxito de la implementación del Big Data en la industria farmacéutica? Could you share with us one success case of implementing Big Data technology in the pharma industry?
Yeah, so I think most of the cases I talk about, you can consider as, big data. But again, the value comes from, and I know big data is a buzzword, correct? It's, big data is essentially saying I've got lots of data, different varieties coming in at different speeds. So if you think of the pharmaceutical space, if you have your PI systems, correct, that you generated data you're generating data by the second or by the minute, lots of that coming in. How do you link that into other types of data to be able to optimize the process? So we've done this where we did what's called an in silico batch modeling that would essentially optimize yield, correct? So that was a classical big data where data coming in at different velocities, multiple, big volumes of data. There was a variety of data, people data, performance data, MES data, and linking all of that together. But my advice to you again would be, for a lot of the value you need to drive, you don't need lots and lots of data, right? So again, I sound like a broken record, but think of what's the impact you want to drive and then figure out how you do it.
At the end of the day, it's more a question of handling flow of data than quantity of data.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Sulay. The third question. Con la ejecución de un modelo digital en las operaciones de una farmacéutica, ¿cuál sería el siguiente paso para el desarrollo de la industria en materia de regulación? Executing a digital model in the pharma operations, what would be the next step, next trend in terms of regulation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and everybody's asking that question. And actually, the regulators are also asking that question.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think there's two. I'll tell you about where the trend is going, and then maybe about what people are doing. But ultimately, what we want to get to is a very autonomous process, correct? So for a lot of the solutions that we build today, there's always what I call a human in the loop. So in my presentation, I talked about the deviations root cause advisor, where you put all the data into a machine learning model. It tells you these are the likely root causes, but somebody has to look at it and then actually take that action.
Exactly.
And then going into the future, you get in the human out of the loop, where the machine learning does all of that. And obviously, to do that, you got to then have the right types of regulations in place. So if you think of things like parametric release, correct, where you understand the quality of what you're producing, and then you just kind of produce it, and it moves out of your factory. I think regulation has a way to go with it, but I think even the FDA, last year I was at an FDA summit where this was a specific topic that they were actually talking about, right? How to actually collaborate with the industry to drive this forward. So I think we're getting there, but there's still some way to go in terms of building trust in the machine learning algorithms that would actually make these decisions.
And regulation and the industry will have to evolve together, hand in hand, into these new technologies.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember when I was at this conference, one of the things one of the senior regulators said was, a lot of times people in the industry says, well, I can't do this because the regulator doesn't want it. And what he said was, actually, come talk to us, right? And let's figure out that, it's not always going to be possible, but come talk to us, as opposed to just always saying, no, can't do it, right?
Exactly.
So.
Thank you. Next question. What recommendations can you give us regarding platforms that can help us to analyze the data of the equipment events, stoppages, alarms, downtime, analysis of efficiency losses, etc.?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'd probably say it's less about the platform and more about getting the data in the right place where you can analyze it, right? So so it's more about, are you actually collecting that data? That will be my question to you. That's the harder part, right? Because if you're not collecting data about your equipment stoppages, if you're not collecting data about your minor stops, then trying to figure out a platform where you put the data is a moot point. But in terms of platforms, there's lots of platforms there, from things that are manufacturing centric to like the big, like the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts, that are actually now building solutions within their platforms that are very specific to manufacturing. But I think there's lots of solutions out there. It's figuring out what's best for you. But I'll say focus on collecting the right type of data that you need.
Exactly. Sounds logical. What competencies do you recommend for the staff participating in the digital pharma?
Yep. So
what skills? Well, competencies and what skills?
Yeah, what skills? Yeah. So you do need a mix of skills, and it's a combination of what I call business and technical. So on the technical side, you need people like the data scientists that will build the models. You need the data engineers that will do a lot of the data curation and the data linking. And that's actually quite difficult. So don't always think of the data scientists. You also need the data engineers. You also need people, what I call translators, right? So people that really understand the process, but also understand the analytics that can bridge that gap, correct? Because what the machine learning tells you, you have to validate, and you can validate that if somebody actually knows the process. And then fundamentally, what you really, really need are the people that are actually going to be using this. They also, it's not new skills, but think of retraining your organization, right? Because if you can't retrain your organization to be able to use these new solutions, tools, and technologies, you're not going to drive the impact. So it's a combination of new skills, but then it's actually a massive reskilling effort that you have to do across your organization.
From the top.
From the top. I mean, just last week, I I think the CEO of, Takeda signed this deal with Accenture and AWS, correct? Where the CEO said in about 10 years he wants everybody at Takeda to be guided by an AI assistant, correct?
Yeah.
So just imagine if you're going to do that, everybody has to understand how do you actually use these tools, right? So it's less about the people that build it and more about who's going to use it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a complete company strategy. Our last question, Sulay, what are the difficulties you have faced and how have you solved them by integrating equipment with different control architectures from manufacturing equipment or different brands? Yeah, how can we match different brands, different equipment manufacturer in a whole system?
Yeah, so I think there's two levels to that question. There's your the IT, so like your SAP, your MES systems, your quality management systems. I think you have less of an issue there, correct? Because with all of those systems, it's all about having the right plug-in connectors, which everybody has today, correct, or something you can develop. The second level to that is more of your OT systems, correct? So the systems that you actually have on a shop floor, which a lot of those actually have sometimes proprietary protocols that they use. So one particular manufacturer may use one type of protocol, another manufacturer uses a different type of protocol. But I think there's a solution to that, correct? I think again, it's widely available in terms of having these gateways that are multi-protocol that can essentially allow you to get that data out, correct? Because once you can get the data out, then it's less about integration, systems integration, and more about data integration. Yeah. So think of it as build a multi-protocol system to get the data out, and then once the data are out, it's just data at that point in time, and it's more about a data integration question.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we had that question, same kind of question yesterday. And yeah, there are solutions for everything. Now, the easier the situation, the easier and cheaper the solution, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sulay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your help, for your presentation, for your knowledge. It's always an honor to have participating in that kind of symposium, someone who has a brand large experience, not only in one company, in a different company facing different situations. It has been an honor and a pleasure. You take care, my friend.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Yeah, have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nos despedimos de Sulay Sandy, agradeciéndole, por supuesto, la calidad de su presentación y compartir su experiencia. Hacemos una pausa y regresamos con la visita virtual de una de las plantas más modernas de Latinoamérica. Muchas gracias. De regreso. Les presento a Adriana Contreras. Adriana Contreras es directora de ingeniería de Grupo PISA. Adriana es la persona que ha participado en el proyecto de construcción de la planta de oncológicos y la planta de inmunosupresores que vamos a visitar en este momento, allá en Tlajomulco. Y Adriana va a ser su guía a través de toda esta visita virtual. Espero que la disfruten. Vamos a una pausa por un café.
Buenos días, soy Adriana Contreras, directora de Ingeniería y Proyectos de PISA Farmacéutica. Quiero agradecerles a todos ustedes por participar en este primer simposio internacional en manufactura de alta contención con integración digital. A nombre del Grupo PISA, del ingeniero Carlos Álvarez Bermejillo, que es nuestro presidente, y de nuestros más de 22,000 colaboradores, agradezco a ISPE International y a la ISPE México Affiliate por permitirnos participar de este evento. Es un honor para nosotros poder acercarnos a todos ustedes como profesionales de diferentes disciplinas, así como autoridades. Quiero compartirles este primer video que representa lo que somos y lo que hacemos en Grupo PISA.
PISA Farmacéutica es una empresa 100% mexicana con 75 años de experiencia en la industria farmacéutica. Sus operaciones siempre se han regido por los más altos estándares internacionales de calidad que aseguran la calidad, eficacia y seguridad de los medicamentos. Para continuar con este compromiso, PISA Farmacéutica ha invertido en la construcción de 2 nuevas plantas, la nueva planta de oncológicos y la nueva planta de inmunosupresores, ambas instaladas en su complejo industrial en Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, Jalisco. Con 10.500 metros cuadrados de construcción, la nueva planta de oncológicos de PISA Farmacéutica alberga la capacidad anual para producir 10 millones de dosis de medicamentos inyectables y 500 millones de dosis de medicamentos sólidos orales. Por otra parte, en 7.500 metros de construcción, la nueva planta de inmunosupresores de PISA Farmacéutica cuenta con la capacidad anual para producir 200 millones de cápsulas, tabletas y frascos. Ambas plantas cuentan con almacenes y servicios críticos totalmente independientes, los cuales garantizan una atención rápida y eficaz. Las 2 nuevas plantas de PISA Farmacéutica cuentan con equipos altamente reconocidos en el mercado internacional por su calidad, confiabilidad y tecnología de vanguardia.
Bem-vindos a las nuevas plantas de oncológicos e inmunosupresores de PISA Farmacéutica. ¿Listos para entrar?
En este primer video pudieron ver nuestro complejo industrial en Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, Jalisco, el corazón de las operaciones de nuestra planta PISA Farmacéutica. Aquí se encuentran la mayoría de nuestras plantas productivas y es también donde se instalaron las 2 nuevas plantas, la de oncológicos y la de inmunosupresores. Vamos a iniciar nuestro recorrido virtual con la línea de sólidos oncológicos orales, que incluye cápsulas y tabletas.
En la industria farmacéutica existe una tendencia hacia la contención con procesos herméticamente sellados, con lo que se busca reducir drásticamente la probabilidad de contaminación y riesgo en la producción de medicamentos. La línea de sólidos orales de la nueva planta de oncológicos de PISA Farmacéutica sigue esta tendencia, alcanzando un nivel de contención Occupational Exposure Band 5. Esto es logrado con el uso de aisladores de muestreo y pesado de activos, con bines y botellas herméticas que son alimentadas por válvulas de seguridad y equipos autocontenidos. La producción comienza con el dispensado a través de un aislador con grado de contención OEB5. Posteriormente, el material pesado pasa a una suite de granulación con capacidad de 300 litros o a un tamizador bin-to-bin, ambos autocontenidos. Los equipos de esta planta cuentan con un sistema automatizado de limpieza tipo Clean in Place y Wash in Place, que reducen la posibilidad de errores humanos y de contaminación cruzada. A continuación, el bin con producto todavía sellado herméticamente llega al mezclador y enseguida a las áreas de encapsulado o tableteo. En el caso de cápsulas, el bin sellado introduce el producto al equipo, una encapsuladora con la capacidad de producir 40.000 cápsulas por hora. En el caso de tabletas, se introduce al equipo que puede producir hasta 600.000 tabletas por hora. Como nivel adicional de seguridad, este equipo monitorea el peso, dureza y espesor del producto. Las tabletas fabricadas se vuelven a recibir en un bin sellado que va al área de recubrimiento. En esta área, un sistema automatizado y autocontenido con capacidad de 350 litros recubre el medicamento, dejándolo listo para el área de acondicionamiento. Con este equipo se logran producir 300 blisters por minuto que nunca están en contacto directo con los operadores gracias al nivel de contención Occupational Exposure Band 5.
Además de los sistemas de autocontención en toda la línea de producción, en la planta de oncológicos de Pisa Farmacéutica contamos con sistemas de tratamiento de aguas residuales, con lo que garantizamos la seguridad del personal y del medio ambiente.
La tecnología utilizada en esta planta de sólidos oncológicos orales presenta un grado de contención y de seguridad que no tiene precedentes en nuestro país y tampoco en Latinoamérica. ¿Qué les pareció el video? Impresionante, ¿no? Ahora vamos a continuar a ver la línea de soluciones y liofilizados oncológicos inyectables.
La segunda línea de la planta de oncológicos de Pisa Farmacéutica se dedica a producir soluciones inyectables y medicamentos liofilizados. La capacidad total de producción puede alcanzar hasta 10 millones de viales anuales. Esta línea también alcanza un nivel de contención Occupational Exposure Band 5.
La producción de soluciones inyectables y medicamentos liofilizados comienza en tanques directamente conectados al área de llenado. Con esto se asegura que el manejo de los componentes de la fórmula solamente se realiza con válvulas de seguridad, bines y botellas herméticas. Estos tanques cuentan con un sistema automatizado de limpieza y un sistema de agitación magnética. Además del Occupational Exposure Band 5, la línea de soluciones inyectables y medicamentos liofilizados cuenta con un sistema totalmente independiente de calefacción, ventilación y aire acondicionado, un sistema de lavado automatizado Wash in Place y un sistema generador de vapor de peróxido de hidrógeno, el cual garantiza las condiciones asépticas en el llenado, liofilizado y engargolado. La llenadora cuenta con balanza integrada que permite pesar el 100% de los viales y que determina el volumen dosificado en tiempo real. A través de un sistema de aislamiento y autocontención, el producto dosificado puede ser llevado a 2 liofilizadores de 20 metros cuadrados completamente integrados a la línea y con sistemas independientes de lavado, automatizado y esterilización. En el último paso del proceso, todos los viales pasan por un sistema automatizado donde se realiza una inspección visual y de hermeticidad. Esto se realiza con cámaras de alta velocidad colocadas en diversos ángulos y con una prueba de fugas y microfugas con la técnica de Headspace Gas Analysis.
La planta de oncológicos de Pisa Farmacéutica representa una gran innovación en la producción de medicamentos. La autocontención con la que cuentan ambas las líneas nos permitirá establecer un estricto control de calidad. Los sistemas independientes y automatizados de lavado nos asegurarán que todos los equipos se limpien bajo estricto control.
Con el video que acabamos de ver, concluimos nuestra visita por la planta de oncológicos de Pisa Farmacéutica. Ahora conoceremos la planta de inmunosupresores. Esta planta es totalmente independiente, con una tecnología de alta contención que de manera simultánea protege a mis compañeros y a los productos que ahí se fabricarán.
Durante 75 años, Pisa Farmacéutica ha sido una empresa pionera en la implementación de tecnología para la industria farmacéutica mexicana. En 7.500 metros cuadrados de construcción, ubicada en el complejo industrial de Tlajomulco de Zúñiga, Pisa Farmacéutica diseñó una planta para la producción de inmunosupresores en sólidos y soluciones orales.
La capacidad de producción de esta planta es de 200 millones de cápsulas, tabletas y frascos al año. Las instalaciones, equipos, almacenes y servicios son completamente independientes de cualquier otra planta en el complejo industrial Tlajomulco.
Al entrar a la planta de inmunosupresores de Pisa Farmacéutica, se cuenta con aisladores de muestreo y pesado de activos, Con bines y botellas herméticas alimentadas a través de válvulas de alta contención, se garantiza la seguridad de los colaboradores en las etapas donde el activo no ha pasado por ninguna dilución y se protege al activo y a los operarios de contaminaciones. Más adelante, se encuentra el área de granulación con equipos autocontenidos con capacidad de 300 litros y tamizador de excipientes. Más bines y botellas herméticas llevan el producto al área de encapsulado o tableteo. Los equipos instalados en la planta de inmunosupresores de Pisa Farmacéutica son autocontenidos y cuentan con elevados estándares de calidad relacionados con la fabricación de tabletas recubiertas, cápsulas y soluciones orales. En total, se pueden producir hasta 40.000 cápsulas por hora y 150.000 tabletas por hora. A continuación se encuentra el área de recubrimiento, que cuenta con un equipo autocontenido con capacidad de 350 litros. Después se llega al área de acondicionamiento con nivel de contención, Occupational Exposure Band 3 y capacidad de producción de 300 blisters por minuto. La planta también fue diseñada para producir soluciones orales, por lo que cuenta con una línea para preparación y dosificado de soluciones con capacidad de producción de 1.2 millones de frascos al año. Los equipos de la planta de inmunosupresores de Pisa Farmacéutica cuentan con sistemas automatizados de limpieza Wash in Place o Clean in Place, lo que garantiza la limpieza y seguridad de cada parte del proceso de producción. Los equipos de la planta aseguran un nivel de contención Occupational Exposure Band 5 a lo largo de toda la línea. Este nivel de contención disminuye a Occupational Exposure Band 3 en el área de acondicionamiento. La alta contención también incluye un sistema de tratamiento de aguas residuales, reafirmando el compromiso de seguridad con nuestros colaboradores y con el medio ambiente. Una planta totalmente independiente, autocontenida y que garantiza la producción de inmunosupresores en sólidos y soluciones orales de alta calidad.
La tecnología de alta contención de esta planta es completamente innovador para México. Si bien el nivel de contención se reduce en la zona de acondicionamiento, es de las tecnologías más seguras en la industria farmacéutica internacional y es un referente a nivel Latinoamérica. Para continuar y para tener un poco más de conocimiento acerca de los niveles de contención que se determinaron para cada una de las plantas, les presentaré el siguiente video en el cual explicaremos qué pasos se siguieron para determinar el Occupational Exposure Band y los beneficios que traería para los colaboradores y para los productos.
Las sustancias altamente activas y riesgosas han tomado mucha presencia en los procesos de manufactura, lo que ha ocasionado un cambio de paradigma en el sector farmacéutico. Esta tendencia ha generado la necesidad de procesos farmacéuticos herméticamente sellados, los cuales se pueden garantizar mediante la incorporación de sistemas y tecnologías de aislamiento y alta contención. Con esta realidad en mente, fue que nacieron los proyectos de construcción de las dos nuevas plantas de Pisa Farmacéutica, la planta de oncológicos y la planta de inmunosupresores.
Con el conocimiento de los principios activos, sus características físicas y los límites de exposición de los operadores, fue que se determinaron los niveles de contención para cada una de las etapas de producción.
Para superar este reto, Pisa Farmacéutica se asoció con fabricantes mundialmente reconocidos por la fabricación de equipos capaces de mantener altos niveles de contención y aislamiento. Estos equipos son capaces de detectar fallas e interrupciones en el flujo del producto, así como de tomar acciones correctivas sin intervención manual y sin tener que interrumpir el sistema cerrado. También cuentan con sistemas de lavado automatizados, SIP o WIP, que permiten realizar operaciones de limpieza minimizando las intervenciones manuales de parte de nuestros colaboradores. Esta tecnología de contención hermética es lo que nos permite proteger de riesgos a los medicamentos que producimos y a los ciudadanos que los necesitan. Estas dos plantas, totalmente independientes e innovadoras, ofrecerán al mercado nacional e internacional productos oncológicos e inmunosupresores que garantizan la protección de personal y del medio ambiente.
Estas dos nuevas plantas se encuentran en el mismo lugar, pero son completamente independientes. Desde los almacenes, las áreas de servicios y hasta los suministros de agua y aire son completamente separados. El diseño que desarrollamos para esta planta nos asegura inocuidad para los productos y un alto grado de seguridad para los colaboradores. Por último, quiero presentar un video de otro tipo de innovación que también se presentó en esta planta, la integración digital a los procesos documentales.
La construcción de las plantas de medicamentos oncológicos e inmunosupresores ha sido un reto en materia de innovación y desarrollo. La contención hermética presenta un alto nivel de seguridad para el producto terminado, para los pacientes y para los colaboradores que se desarrollarán en estas plantas. Y un tema adicional en el que PISA Farmacéutica ha invertido es la reciente tendencia de la industria internacional, el Digital Pharma.
Para la implementación de un modelo Digital Pharma, es necesario un enfoque integral, debido a 5 cambios fundamentales en la forma en que se producirán los productos farmacéuticos en el futuro. 1. Dominio avanzado de los productos y los procesos. 2. Simulaciones digitales en tiempo real. 3. Análisis predictivo de escenarios. 4. Asistencia de operaciones digitales. Y 5. Automatización y robótica con aplicaciones al conocimiento del trabajo. La planta de medicamentos oncológicos y la planta de medicamentos inmunosupresores integran el concepto del Digital Pharma, lo que significa que cada una de las plantas cuenta con un sistema supervisor SCADA. El sistema supervisor SCADA es una plataforma que centraliza las señales de los equipos de producción, robustece el control de las operaciones y permite el monitoreo en tiempo real de los procesos. Este sistema es la base para integrar plataformas más avanzadas tipo MES, como el MII SAP y el concepto EBR. Con este último, ambas plantas eliminarán por completo la necesidad de papel para mantener al día su documentación. Los beneficios directos del Digital Pharma son la gestión centralizada de recetas, el control de usuarios y trazabilidad de la operación, cumplimiento al requerimiento CFR 21 parte 11, información en tiempo real, contar con información asequible para la solución de problemas por prioridad, cálculos de eficiencia global de equipos y contar con la base para realizar un análisis avanzado de datos estadísticos. Esta es la nueva forma de producir medicamentos.
Como bien dice el video, esta es la nueva forma de producir medicamentos y será parte esencial del corazón de Grupo PISA, una empresa con más de 75 años de historia. Estas 2 nuevas plantas son orgullosamente mexicanas. Muchas gracias por su atención. Soy Adriana Contreras.
Bienvenidos de regreso. Adriana, muchísimas gracias y muchas felicidades por este bello proyecto. Tenemos algunas preguntas del público y del público de la asistencia. Y nos acompaña aquí Gustavo Mezzaliera, que es el director de manufactura de la planta de oncológicos. Gustavo, muchas gracias.
Así es, gracias Felipe por su invitación. Es un placer estar aquí con ustedes y participar de este evento. Será un gusto contestar las preguntas de los asistentes.
Ahí vamos. La primera pregunta. ¿Por qué PISA decidió construir las plantas con equipo autocontenidos en lugar de utilizar contención a nivel de sala? ¿Dónde buscó referencias sobre la tecnología de contención instalada en estas plantas?
Muy bien. Es buena esta pregunta porque pues, nos puede dar un poco de la historia del proyecto, ¿no? Entonces, cuando PISA decidió invertir en estas dos nuevas plantas, se llamó los proveedores de nivel internacional para talleres, para que nos presentasen las tecnologías disponibles para fabricación de medicamentos de alta potencia, ¿no? Con esto, una vez presentadas las opciones que teníamos, se llevaron a cabo visitas de benchmark en Europa, en especial en Alemania y Italia, además de una capacitación en plantas de alta contención en Alemania ofrecida por uno de nuestros proveedores. Después de tomar conocimiento y estar actualizado con la tecnología, entonces se decidió por los equipos de alta contención y no de contención nivel 4. Además de esto, las plantas de alta contención son una tendencia mundial y lo que hace que también se reduce el riesgo de contaminación a los operarios y el medio ambiente. Yo creo que para cerrar esto es importante mencionar que el costo operativo de una planta autocontenida es reducido cuando se compara con una planta de nivel de contención nivel 4. Entonces, todo el tema de equipos de protección individual, filtros de sistema de HVAC, se reduce este gasto que al mediano plazo nos hace con que la inversión se justifique, porque sí es una inversión inicial un poco más elevada cuando comparada con niveles de contención nivel de sala.
Sí, es una inversión que se recupera sobre costos de operación menores.
Así es.
Y mayor seguridad. Segunda pregunta, Gustavo. ¿Qué fue decisivo en la elección de los principales proveedores de equipos para estas plantas?
Indudablemente fue la reconocida calidad de los proveedores que fueron escogidos para nos fornecer la tecnología, que son proveedores con la calidad reconocida a nivel internacional y que podemos observar en las plantas las cuales visitó el equipo de proyecto.
La alta tecnología de los equipos de estas plantas ciertamente requiere personas altamente capacitadas. Regresamos al tema del personal. ¿Cómo preparó PISA a su gente para estar preparada para operar estas plantas?
PISA tomó una sabia decisión de contratar las personas de manera bastante temprana. Estamos diciendo ahí cerca de 6, 7 meses del arranque de la planta. Esto proporcionó que estas personas, no solamente operarios, mas sí personas de mantenimiento, personas de los equipos de validación, de transferencia de tecnología, tuviesen contacto con los principales proveedores durante las fases de startup de estos equipos, pruebas tempranas de placebo. Entonces, con esto sí logramos capacitar un grupo que consideramos que está adecuado para participar y arrancar esta planta de forma con bastante suceso.
Perfecto. Gustavo, muchísimas gracias. Dejo la palabra a quien sigue, otra persona del proyecto de PISA que nos va a poder contestar otras preguntas. Ahorita regresamos.
Buen día. Estamos de regreso con nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Está aquí a mi lado el compañero Juan José Gutiérrez, director de validación del Grupo PISA, que nos va a contestar algunas preguntas de los asistentes. Juan, pregunta uno de los asistentes: ¿qué pruebas se realizan para validar la contención de plantas de medicamentos de alta potencia?
Ok, buen día a todos. Bueno, antes de responder esto, creo que tenemos que tener en mente las bases para definir la estrategia de validación de una planta de productos de alta potencia. Hay 3 elementos que debemos de tener siempre en mente para definir nuestras pruebas. Primero es que en una planta de productos de alta potencia convergen tanto requerimientos de buenas prácticas de manufactura, que es lo que estamos acostumbrados a manejar, como requerimientos de seguridad del personal y seguridad del medio ambiente. El segundo elemento, la segunda base que debemos de tener en cuenta es el diseño de nuestros propios productos, de nuestros procesos y de nuestros equipos, el cual se espera que sea congruente en sus características. El tercer elemento que debemos de tener en cuenta para definir nuestra estrategia de validación es precisamente en base al layout que tenemos en nuestra planta, tener muy claras cuáles son las barreras de contención a los distintos espacios de la planta. En general, esperaríamos tener al menos una especie de 3 anillos concéntricos, donde partimos del corazón del proceso y terminamos en la comunicación de la planta con el exterior. Entonces, teniendo estas 3 bases, nuestras pruebas deberían de incluir, primero, el evaluar el corazón del proceso, es decir, donde realizamos nuestras actividades o nuestras operaciones unitarias. Y allí tenemos 2 opciones, según lo que hemos visto durante la semana. Podemos tener equipos autocontenidos, como los que hemos visto en el video, en el cual la estrategia de validación es demostrar que cada uno de esos equipos realmente logra el nivel de contención para el que fue diseñado. Si mi equipo es OEB5, tengo que demostrar que realmente lo es. Para eso, básicamente, lo que hacemos es tomar muestras del aire en el entorno del equipo. Ese aire se analiza en general por métodos gravimétricos o por métodos analíticos o una combinación de ambos. Si mi planta o mi proceso no tiene equipos autocontenidos, entonces invariablemente mi personal va a traer su equipo de protección personal. Entonces mis pruebas se basarán en demostrar que ese equipo de protección personal funciona. Entonces también vamos a tomar muestras del aire que está respirando la persona para ver que sea seguro, que sea con el nivel de residuos de producto que establecimos para ese producto en particular. Bueno, después sería evaluar el siguiente nivel de contención de la planta, que será a nivel de áreas de manufactura, que allí podría tener 2 opciones, que tenga la contención en cada cuarto específico, por ejemplo, donde realiza un área de una operación de tableteado o de encapsulado, o pudiera ser que mi contención sea a nivel de módulo de fabricación. En ambos casos debo de tener o debo de ayudarme con la combinación del layout y del diseño del sistema de aire HVAC. Vamos a tener una serie de burbujas o de pozos para evitar que el aire de proceso se nos vaya del corazón de manufactura hacia áreas generales de la planta. Y por último, tengo que tener la evaluación de mis procedimientos para el tratamiento de mis residuos sólidos, de mis residuos o mis desfogues de aire y mis desfogues de agua. En general sería la estrategia de validación de la planta.
Muy bien, Juan, gracias. Creo que esto, la última parte de que usted acaba de contestar va muy en línea de la siguiente pregunta que recibimos. Los asistentes nos preguntan, ¿cuáles son los lineamientos generales para tratar los residuos sólidos de aire extraído y aguas de drenaje de las plantas donde se fabrican productos de alta potencia?
Ok, bueno, pues iniciamos con el aire. En alguna de las presentaciones nos platicaban que el requerimiento oficial que se maneja a nivel mundial es que la última etapa de tratamiento del aire o de filtración del aire sea con filtros H14. Eso tendremos que cumplirlo. Lo que pudiera ser diferente es las etapas de pretratamiento, que dependiendo de la cantidad de residuos pudiera incluso necesitar un colector de polvos de unas características especiales para este tipo de procesos. Si mis residuos son pocos, pues pudiera ser que nada más tenga una prefiltración sencilla y mi filtración final con H14. Entonces, aquí deberíamos de demostrar que la integridad de mis filtros H14 está correcta tanto al inicio como periódicamente. Ahora, en lo que se refiere a tratamiento de agua, tal vez sea un poco más complicado porque necesitamos tener la lista de principios activos a manejar en nuestra planta. Debemos identificar aquellos que son más difíciles de inactivar y normalmente tendremos que hacer pruebas a nivel laboratorio con distintos tipos de tratamiento para ver cuál es más efectivo y que a su vez nos genera menos residuos del propio tratamiento que después tengamos que también tratar. Normalmente van a ser métodos de oxidación. Hay proveedores y compañías especializadas que te pueden ayudar a definir qué tratamiento, o sea, los tiempos, características de tu tratamiento del agua. Y por último, lo que se refiere a residuos sólidos, siempre deberás de tener ya algún convenio con una compañía especializada y autorizada para el manejo de residuos sólidos. El quehacer como planta de manufactura es demostrar que nuestro procedimiento de empaque y tratamiento del exterior de los contenedores en que voy a sacar esos residuos sólidos es seguro. O sea, la manera en que yo se lo entrego a mi proveedor, necesito demostrar que es seguro. Creo que a grandes rasgos son las principales características a cumplir.
Muy bien. Llegó una última pregunta aquí con temas de validación. ¿Cuáles son los principales beneficios? Perdón. ¿Cuáles son las...
No creo que ya.
No, perdón. Se quedaron aquí, acaban de llegar algunas preguntas de Digital Pharma. Quien va a nos enseñar, quien nos va a platicar sobre este tema es nuestro compañero Francisco López. En minutos regresamos para que Francisco entonces pueda nos contestar las preguntas referentes a Digital Pharma e integración digital. Gracias. Estamos de regreso. Aquí conmigo está el compañero Francisco Pérez, que nos va a contestar algunas preguntas que nos llegaron sobre Digital Pharma e integración digital. Francisco, la primera pregunta que nos llega es, ¿cuáles son los principales beneficios que PISA busca lograr con la implementación del Digital Pharma?
Muy bien, muy buenos días. Los beneficios, a mí me gustaría comentarlos en dos partes. Como beneficios inmediatos, visualizamos contar hay que recordar que integración digital tiene que ver con cómo llevar las señales de los equipos y los datos de fábrica del piso de trabajo, el shop floor, cómo llevarlos a ambiente electrónico, ambiente digital. Entonces, los primeros beneficios es esa centralización de información de los equipos, tenerla nosotros en niveles digitales, en niveles de servidor. Esa centralización es un beneficio, contar con esas señales de manera central. Un siguiente beneficio es la gestión de usuarios de los equipos. La manera tradicional de gestionar los operadores de los equipos, la manera tradicional es manera local. Nosotros estamos buscando que eso sea distinto y que la gestión de los usuarios sea de manera centralizada a nivel servidor, a nivel con las políticas del manejo de redes de la empresa. Entonces, ahí tendríamos también un cambio y un beneficio al uso de las políticas de integración de IT puestas en el piso de trabajo de manufactura. Un siguiente beneficio es la gestión centralizada de recetas. ¿Esto qué significa? Cada equipo cuenta con una configuración, un conjunto de parámetros de proceso que le llamamos receta de máquina. Esta centralización y gestión de recetas nos va a dar el beneficio de que de manera central podemos sincronizar el set de máquinas, las máquinas de toda la línea, y podemos evitar errores de operadores, porque la sincronización de máquinas la vamos a hacer de manera central a través de un sistema SCADA. Entonces, esto es un beneficio, es un pocayoke, es un mecanismo para evitar errores. Un siguiente beneficio es la gestión de lotes. La plataforma SCADA Supervisor nos facilita la gestión de lotes, el lote actual y el lote siguiente nos da la oportunidad de hacer esa preparación. Otro beneficio viene a ser el cumplimiento a CFR 21 parte 11, que viene a ser el manejo de registros electrónicos, el manejo de firmas electrónicas y el audit trail, la integridad de datos. Todo esto tenemos la oportunidad de dar cumplimiento al tener las señales de los equipos, de los HMIs, de los PLCs, de cada una de las máquinas puestos en un nivel SCADA supervisor, nos da la oportunidad de tener la trazabilidad de cada evento de máquina, de cada transacción que realice el operador en su máquina. Vamos a tener ese histórico a nivel central. Otro beneficio más es esta integración digital nos da la oportunidad de tener una característica que se le llama acceso remoto. O sea, los equipos se pueden manejar de manera local o de manera centralizada a través de este cuarto de control, este es SCADA supervisor. Entonces, esos son los beneficios, como yo le llamaría, inmediatos, y unos beneficios posteriores es, una vez que contamos con la información centralizada, nosotros tenemos la oportunidad de comunicar otras plataformas, otras capas, que por ahí en el video les compartíamos, que son plataformas tipo MES, tipo MII en SAP, y a través de estas plataformas vamos a lograr tener el expediente electrónico de manufactura, que se le llama Electronic Batch Record. Y otro beneficio también adicional es, con toda la información centralizada, servidores, en bases de datos, tenemos la base para posteriores análisis avanzados de datos estadísticos. Esos creemos que son nuestros principales beneficios.
Fantástico, Francisco. Vamos con la siguiente pregunta. ¿Cuáles son los retos que PISA ha tenido para lograr la integración digital de los equipos de manufactura instalados en las plantas?
Correcto. Relacionado a los retos que hemos tenido, bueno, en un inicio, al ser un tema nuevo para PISA, lo que hemos hecho, hemos llevado un rigor en metodología de software y de ciclo de máquina, y nos hemos mantenido cumpliendo etapas de requerimientos de usuario, de revisión de estos requerimientos y de apoyarnos con empresas consultoras que nos han apoyado en robustecer estos requerimientos. Y después estos requerimientos los hemos llevado con los proveedores a revisiones de diseño, talleres, workshop de diseño con los proveedores, y una vez consolidado el diseño, pues ya ha sido ya labor de los proveedores en la construcción, y después hemos hecho, como parte del ciclo de revisión del software y de la máquina, las revisiones de FAT y de SAT correspondientes para verificar y asegurarnos que nuestro sistema da cumplimiento a los requerimientos planificados. También algo que nos ha ayudado mucho es que los equipos tienen un nivel tecnológico que favorece las integraciones digitales. Entonces, estos equipos cuentan con estas características, cuentan con una arquitectura de control muy innovadora, en un PLC, un HMI, una SCADA de cada uno de los equipos, que facilita la integración hacia sistemas y capas superiores, como SCADA, supervisores o plataformas tipo SAP.
Muy bien. Nos acaba de llegar la última pregunta aquí, Francisco. Entonces, para cerrar nuestra sesión de preguntas y respuestas, ¿cómo se hace la conexión a partir de la máquina hacia las capas superiores del sistema SCADA?
Correcto, correcto. Bueno, comentábamos, hay que recordar que cada equipo, bueno, de los equipos que contamos en la planta, cuentan con una arquitectura de control del equipo, de la máquina. Esta arquitectura, en términos de control, principalmente es el PLC, que viene a ser nuestra computadora industrial del equipo. Cuenta con un HMI, que viene a ser la pantalla con la que interactúa el operador, y cuenta con un SCADA que hace las operaciones del equipo. Entonces, esa arquitectura, a través de una red industrial que se le llama Ethernet, una red industrial, hacemos la conexión a un SCADA supervisor, que viene a ser un servidor robusto, que hace las conexiones a cada uno de los equipos. Entonces, SCADA supervisor hace una sincronización, hace una recolección de data, de señales, y hace también una sincronización de informaciones, como ejemplo, las recetas de máquina, las informaciones de lote, gestión de lotes. Entonces, hay una comunicación bidireccional, equipo a servidor SCADA y SCADA supervisor, una sincronización a máquina. Como platicaba, esta sincronización nos da la ventaja de evitar errores y mantener equipos con recetas correctas respecto a los lotes que queremos producir. Entonces, de manera global, esa podría ser la explicación.
Muy bien. Gracias, Francisco, por tu participación. Gracias por tus respuestas. Nos quedamos por aquí. Enseguida regresamos con Felipe y Jaime Castro para hacer el cierre del evento. Gracias a todos los asistentes.
Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Gracias.
Bienvenidos de regreso. Última apariencia, ya estamos cerrando este evento. Espero que este evento les haya gustado. Quiero, antes de pasar la palabra a Jaime Castro, presidente del ISPE México Affiliate, quiero felicitar a PISA por haber tomado riesgos en su decisión de inversión en una planta de muy alta tecnología y felicitarlos para esto y agradecerles mucho habernos abierto las puertas de su planta. No es tan fácil, no es tan común que un laboratorio de primer nivel nos permita visitar sus instalaciones. Muchísimas gracias al equipo de PISA. Dejo la palabra a Jaime Castro. Jaime.
Muchas gracias, Felipe. Bueno, han sido 3 meses de trabajo, realmente, con más de 20 personas involucradas en este esfuerzo para realizar este evento. Fueron 4 días de evento, cada uno con 3 horas, lo que nos da un total de 12 horas de transmisión de todo el evento. 13 ponentes de 5 países presentando las mejores tecnologías y más avanzadas del mundo y con casi 700 asistentes. Por lo anterior, yo podría decir que el evento ha sido un éxito. Y bueno, con este evento además estamos prácticamente llegando al primer aniversario de ISPE México Affiliate. Y es un gusto saber que llegamos cumpliendo con el objetivo de ISPE México, que es el proveer soluciones a través de la tecnología y el crecimiento del personal para el mejor cumplimiento regulatorio. Entonces, pues de mi parte es un agradecimiento para todos los que han estado trabajando en este importante esfuerzo. Esperemos superarlo el año que entra y gracias especialmente, Philippe, por todo lo que sé que te ha representado también de esfuerzo. Y pues muchas gracias también a todos los asistentes por estar con nosotros. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Jaime. Sí, efectivamente ha sido un trabajo duro, pero muy agradable, una experiencia nueva. El trabajar con equipos de producción de este tipo no ha sido inmediato, pero nos acostumbramos y hasta lo disfrutamos. Quiero agradecer a nuestros patrocinadores, las 3 compañías que nos han acompañado en esta aventura, QBD, Eolis y T5DC. Y quiero agradecer al equipo, a todo el equipo que ha trabajado aquí. Aquí estamos 2, pero acá atrás hay todo un equipo muy profesional. Ovation, felicidades y muchísimas gracias. Como dijo Jaime, creo que cumplimos con el objetivo de ISPE. Tenemos que seguir, hay muchos proyectos en puerta y vamos a seguir trabajando. Gracias a todos por su asistencia, espero que haya sido de su interés. Les pido un último favor. Envíennos sus comentarios, no les vamos a mandar una encuesta de satisfacción, no está previsto en nuestro manual de calidad, pero envíennos sus comentarios, qué les pareció el evento, tanto la forma como el fondo, sobre todo el fondo, insistimos mucho. Muchas gracias, hasta pronto.
Gracias.
Y cuídense, todos.
Excelente. Gracias, felicidades.